So yeah, as Mike said, welcome to Visual Studio Code for OpenEdge. Work smart, code faster. We'll just do a bit of intro. Um, There we go. My name is Peter Judge. I am a consultant and architect at Consulting Work. Have been here for coming up for 3 years now, after a fairly long time at Progress Software. I'm worked in ABL 4GL since '96. That's also come here for a long time, like many of you, but not all of you. And I am mainly a back-end kind of guy. Don't do HTTP stuff, has a remigration, and you can find me at Progress Communities, other Progress Communities with a little c, Pugs, other events, and webinars such as this. As I mentioned, we work at Consulting Work. We're an independent IT consulting organization headquartered in Cologne in Germany. We have subsidiaries across Europe and in the US, so UK, Romania. We're mainly an OpenEdge shop, but we also work with related technology and have customers pretty much all around the world. We should update the North America to include South America. But yeah, consulting services, you'd guess that from the name, and development tools. Our smart component library is the best migration backend you can get, or the best development framework in OpenEdge, we think. And we focus a lot on application modernization. Yeah, as I said, mainly in OpenEdge, all parts of it, from development tools to PASA-WE, but also the UI parts, Telerik, Kendo, and a bunch of the other products. As I said, we have also a fairly well-established skills in DevOps. As people modernize the applications, they move a lot more into the CI/CD pipelines with Jenkins and such things. Right. Before we go any further, I would say a friendly reminder. Maybe you need a time machine like a TARDIS, but OpenEdge 11.7 was officially retired 2 days ago. So you really should start, if you haven't already, move to OpenEdge 12. That's going to mean a few changes typically. Going to move from Classic App Server to PaaS, but 12 is the way to go. It's really where you need to be. 12.8 especially. OpenEdge 12.2 has got another couple of years left, but the kind of LTS to move to is really OpenEdge 12.8. Yeah. So today's agenda, we'll look a little bit at Visual Studio Code, and then kind of look at the things that I do, I suppose, in my day-to-day development environment. Compile code, it's quite important in the OpenEdge world. We'll run some unit tests, which you really should be doing. I know not everybody does. Run that code to test it, even manually. Debug someone else's code, because of course it's never my code that's broken, but and then some additional functions in our framework. I'll get into that, but I may want to extract some annotations from some ABL code. So, what is Visual Studio Code? It's a free, as in beer and as in code, open source code editor. Microsoft deliberately calls it a code editor, not an IDE. I suspect that's because they have an IDE called Visual Studio, and it's available on Windows, Linux, Mac OS. It's really quite powerful. It's a bunch of core functionality. It's largely written and extended in TypeScript, JavaScript, and it's extended via a bunch of extensions. I may misspeak here and call them plugins, but the technical term is extensions. These are available mainly through a central repository, which Microsoft owns and controls. There are other third-party repositories where you can get extensions. Not all extensions are available on all of those. They generally are all available through the Microsoft repository. What's nice about it is this first-class support for source control tools, so Git, Perforce, whatever other ones you may choose to use. And it's, again, really tightly integrated into the experience. Remote access is also very, very nice. And from your Windows machine, SSH to a Docker container, or work in a Docker container, but also onto a remote Unix box. The storage of settings and sharing of that is really nice. I'll touch on that in a sec. Yeah, and as far as history, it's been around for 10 years. Well, it was announced 10 years ago, released in 2016. And one of the really potent, powerful things that really adds a lot of value into Visual Studio Code is the language server protocol. If you go to any of Gilles Carré's talks on Visual Studio Code, he goes into some detail about that. But that's really the set of APIs that let you plug languages into Visual Studio Code very easily, relatively easily. And so why you see so many languages that are added into VS Code. So the VS Code look and feel is kind of like this. As I said, they call it a code editor, but really is far closer to an IDE. Different pieces. The command palette is where you're going to, well, the editor is where you're going to spend a lot of time, most of your time, but you'll spend a fair amount of time in the command palette. Open commands, run commands. You can see Control P, Shift Control P. You'll get used to that. And yeah, we'll talk a bit about. Excuse me. We will be in the editor and the activity bar extensions. So yeah, those are kind of the pieces we look to. The other concept that's in Visual Studio Code, and from the beginning, was the concept of workspaces. At first, a folder, a project was a workspace, so you could have one workspace with one folder, but that was extended fairly quickly to what we call multi-root code spaces. So that's kind of analogous to the codes or the workspaces you see in PDSOE in Eclipse. The one really nice thing about, or I think I like at any rate, about Visual Studio Code is pretty much all of the settings that you'll find, all of the configuration is in JSON format, which makes it easier to read, I think. You know, XML has got certain, well, the bracket tags, the angle bracket tags, but all of the configuration is in JSON. And so we can define a workspace as a file with a code-workspace extension. It looks something like this. This is obviously trimmed down a bit. And that you use that to launch your Studio Code or your VS Code workspace. We would recommend you check that into source control. There's a couple of other files that should be checked into your source control, and that just makes the developer experience much simpler. Right? They just have to double-click effectively in Windows, double-click on that file, and they get a workspace predefined for them. The workspaces can keep a whole bunch of stuff in them, common settings. Obviously, the folders, where are the projects for that workspace, is important, but you can have per workspace settings, including tasks, launch configurations, etc. The settings are also quite powerful, and they kind of live at three levels. From the broadest at a user level, so each user has, the machine user has a set of settings. Workspaces have their settings, and then each individual folder can have its own settings. You can synchronize user settings across multiple machines through a Microsoft service. You can sign in with your OneDrive if you have OneDrive settings, and Microsoft will synchronize all of your user level settings across machines. That can be quite nifty for things like extensions as well, so you don't have to reinstall extensions and set up, so that the setup on a new machine or a customer machine in our case can be much, much quicker, just limited to signing into your account.
Peter, I don't know if you can hear me, but we've lost your audio. Looks like you're muted.
I'm sorry. I did not deliberately mute myself.
That looks better now. Sounds better now.
Where did you lose me? Sorry.
A minute ago.
Oh, okay. So
on the OneDrive login for the settings sync.
Okay. I'm sorry about that. Not that I need a reason to repeat myself now. But basically, on settings can be saved on OneDrive. And the important thing I said after that, or the more important thing after that, was that some of this demo stuff I'll show you, the launch configs, the settings, I'm going to do in user settings, but you would typically set that up at a workspace level and check that into source control so all your developers can benefit from that. Also, just make a comment, since I now can see my go-to dialog again, just remind you that you probably want to turn off your cameras, because we will be saving these recordings for later. Thank you. Okay. So let's go there. Let's go there. That was weird that it. So the first thing we want to do is compile code, right? That's kind of important. And the extension that we use and that we recommend use, and that's the kind of the main one. If you search in the extensions store for OpenEdge, you will see surprisingly many extensions. The Riverside extension, this OpenEdge ABL extension, is the one we recommend you use. It's one we use. I've done for, I don't know, it must be at least a year, maybe 18 months now, pretty much all my development, except for UI development in Visual Studio Code, and using the Riverside extension. It's based on a couple of older extensions that are still in the shop, or still in the extension store, and the major difference between those and this extension is this one uses the language server. So you can have more than one installed of these jobs, of this extension, I'm sorry, installed, but you will want to use this one. It's under reasonably active development. There are releases, probably once a month at this point, into the maybe even faster into the pre-release stream. The releases are a little slower than that. There was another thought that came and went in my mind. Yeah, so we will use the ABL extension for that. The other important thing to note is that there's no distinction, unlike we'll talk about the settings in a sec, but one of the other nice things about this extension is that you can use multiple Progress versions or OpenEdge versions inside of the same Visual Studio Code project, which has some benefits, and you don't have to switch tooling to get there. So configuration, there are a bunch of standard settings. If you go to the settings view, Control comma, we can take a look at those, for a few things like, do you prefer upper or lowercase code, what's the default project, what's the default OpenEdge version, things like that. The OpenEdge versions, DLC locations, are stored in settings, and by default that's in the user settings, because that's the closest thing to a machine global set of settings that there are. So in there you will say, you can see up top here, I have a pointer. Over here, I have an OE version that just says 12.8. And so that, how does the extension know where that lives? There's a file that it's in the settings, of course, and usually in the user settings. A couple of other things, obviously. Sorry. So this is the OpenEdge-project JSON file. So this is stored in each of your OpenEdge project. It defines that a particular folder path project in a workspace is an OpenEdge project. If this file is not there, then it's not an OpenEdge project. It's got things that you would typically expect. Again, the OpenEdge version, graphical mode, true or false. So is that going to be pro win on Windows or _progress on On Windows, obviously, that has no meaning in a Unix environment. Character set, extra parameters, so that's basically your PF stuff. You can see the defaults here. You could just put a -pf in there and have that. The build path is an interesting one, and it splits kind of like PDS does. It splits your build path into two types of entries, one being the pro path stuff, which is just used for reference, as it were. One is the source type is what gets built. So you can have multiple of those in there depending on how your pro path is structured, depending on how you want them built. There's an entry in, there's an additional option called build path, not build path, builder, I think, which is where you want the R code to go. In our default environments, we put the R code next to the source code. We don't put it into a different environment, but you may want it in a different place, and you could do that either globally for all of the R code, or you could have it per source entry. It depends on how you build stuff. So that's important to know. And the other important thing to know is this num threads. That's a little misleading. But what it means is how many AVMs are going to get used to build your application. So, so you may, by default, as you know, the OpenEdge runtime is single-threaded. But if we use 6 AVMs to compile this project, so you can ramp that up to any number. There is a limiter in the settings, but generally, you want it for bigger projects to be fairly large. It results in your build times being drastically faster. We can build, 10,000 files or whatever it is in a couple of minutes. It's not instantaneous, but it's pretty damn quick. The other thing that you should know that's useful is why is there a schema file property here in addition to the database connection? And that is because the language server uses this DF file to help you with auto-completion, syntax completion in the editor. It does not use the database connection. It uses that schema file. So if you don't have one of those, your database schemas aren't going to autocomplete tables and fields and things like that. The other interesting thing, and again, this depends on your build environment or your environment, is profiles. So we can add additional profiles at the bottom here. I don't have any in this example, where we basically can override pieces of this configuration. So for instance, you might have your default being a character, a Windows, a GUI build environment, but you might also want to have a profile for a character one. So you would say, give it a name and say options. The graphical mode will then be false. You may want to add different assemblies locations or different, for instance, you may want to add CLR net core if you want to use the .NET Core runtime on Windows versus the .NET Framework runtime, which is the default. So things like that you can provide in a profile and switch those at runtime. And that gives you different behaviors. So in the compiler, one big difference, and it's one thing that you need to get used to be honest, is that the compiling automatically happens. When you save a file, it gets compiled. There's no as there is in the procedure editor or in Progress Developer Studio, option to say, right-click, compile code. It just happens. It can be a little disconcerting because it happens just automatically. You get used to it. You can force it by saving a file. There doesn't have to be any changes in the file. You can just say Control S and it will force a file. But also, when you start getting used to working with Visual Studio Code, you're like, did that save? You kind of mistrust your own code a little bit. You're like, did that actually save? Was it actually compiled? So that you need to get used to. Usually a check is done on extension start. So when you start Visual Studio Code, depends on configuration, when and what you want to automatically build. But you can force a whole project to rebuild using the ABL rebuild project command. This is not a clean clean would delete the R code first and then recompile. This just is recompile everything. And there is an option, a command, compile current buffer for files that are not in a project. So you can just compile those and see if they work. Compile errors get the famous red squigglies. There's a red editor mark in the editor, and then standard problems and the standard problems view as well. So you can see what problems are there. You can also look at the output of the language server if you really want to see that when you save the file it compiles. And we also see the Sonar Cube issues if that's configured in the editor. So compiling. First thing after the code compiles, right, is we run unit tests. Or we want to run unit tests. Unit tests are a really important thing to our software development practices. We have, Mike will know the answer better than I, some 10,000 plus tests that we run in our build environment.
We've just reached 19,000 and a couple hundred.
So there we go. Call it 20,000. It will be generous tests. And it's, yeah, again, it helps us a lot in our development environment. So being able to do unit tests inside of Visual Studio Code is really important. And what we use for that now, more and more and more, because it's come on in leaps and bounds, is the ABL unit test runner. So this is an extension that's available. I updated that screenshot, I think, on the 25th of March on 1.1.3. Ken uses the odd number, even number kind of Linuxy version for the pre-release ones, but now it's 1.1.11. So under fairly rapid development, fairly heavy development, and it plugs really nicely into excuse me, the Visual Studio Code test environment. So it kind of marries that with the ABL unit testing libraries that Progress provides. Really nice integration. So if you want to run the tests, so as I said, integrates the unit testing framework. You can also use the OpenEdge project JSON file for configuration defaults, but also has its own configuration in this file over here. So that's kind of similar to how it works in PDSOE. When you do a new test, it kind of inherits from the project you're in. So we can run a test case from the editor, I'll screenshot in a sec, or from the activity bar. So on the left, this is an activity bar. Tests are this beaker. And from there, we can run all of the tests, or we could right-click and run an individual test. Right? So if you've got a lot of tests, you want to run through them all, you're going to run them from that whole folder. If you do that, certainly when you have as many as we do, you're going to want to make sure that you have a fairly high timeout. The default, I think, is 30 seconds when the unit test's timeout is being running too long. And that's just because this is not meant to be a CI/CD environment. This is just a bunch of tests. But you can land up having the tests run long. You may also have tests that are deliberately running long, right? With you want to check timeouts in your backend or whatever, you're going to have long timeouts. So that's the one way to run them. More typically, you're going to run them from your editor view, from the editor, and we can just see in the gutter on the left here, there's some tests that have passed or failed, and we can run them from there. That's really neat, really quick, really simple. Another view is at the bottom panel. There's a test results panel, and we can run and rerun tests from there. So we kind of get an ability to run unit tests from multiple places, but also feedback, which is really important in multiple places. So you can see in the test results view, we can see we've got 3 tests and the program that have passed. Itself, that would have been if there were any before or afters. And we can see the kind of results here. And there's a lot of detail that you can drill into from there. So the results, as I said, that plugs right into the standard ABL unit way of working with things. It writes out a results.xml file, but it also will write into this test results view. You can see over here, this is one of the standard Microsoft or standard Visual Studio Code views in the panel. And it will say, I ran this test. Any message output that came, there's an error, it threw an error, it failed, right? So we can see that in the view. Yeah, we can also see in the test itself, right? Very, very visibly, that test failed. Here's the error that failed, right? So you can see this is the world's simplest test, I think, but false is not true, so we get an error. If there's a system error that's raised, right? That's what we can see happened there. And our message that was written out. There's also an option to run, I'll show you how to do that, to run unit tests with coverage, right? So that uses the profiler, the ABL profiler to do coverage, but we can also see the coverage levels, right? What ran, etc. Very, very, very handy. Okay, so enough slides for a sec, and let me just switch to my VS Code, which is over there. And again, just to touch on some of the bits and pieces that we have, I'm going to increase that so you can see it a bit better. Hopefully, if that's not readable, Michael, you just tell me. Yeah, so
Peter, maybe one level bigger.
Like that?
Oh yes.
Okay, great. It is the joy of more modern tools that like zooming in and out becomes so much easier. Yeah, so I guess I've got some updates to do. I'm willing to bet at least one of these is an OpenEdge one. No, it's not. Okay. So our activity bar, you'll find yourself navigating up and down. You can drag a lot of this stuff around and reorganize your desktop to how you want to. So I know, for instance, some people like the tree on the right or the outline on the right. There's a lot of stuff you can do there. But the most important thing right now, for us when we're building is the editor, right? So we have, standard. I'm going to do a thing. You can see I've got some kinds of blue squiggles. That's a spelling one. If I save this now, it's going to fail to compile and put nice red squigglies on it, right? So we can see that in the problems view over here. And I've just limited that down to my current program. Again, takes getting used to. We can look in the ABL language server output. As I said, maybe that's a bit nerdy, but I kind of looked there to see that it failed and that it has succeeded. The problems view is where you're typically going to see these errors. Right, so...
But Peter,
yep.
You mentioned earlier that when you get started using and well, you went through it, I went through it, you really don't know whether it compiled your code. In the language server output, you actually get a confirmation for that, like in the console of Developer Studio.
Yes, that's very true. That's a good point. And so to get to here, this output view has got lots of stuff in it, lots and lots of stuff. So the ABL language server is an option here where you can see that stuff. There is also an ABL output view, and that's we'll get into that when we talk about running things, but you'll see messages in here. ABL is not the one where you'll see whether it compiled or not. If you want to force the compile, again, Shift-Control-P brings up the command bar. I use F1, which does the same thing, but it's easier for me to remember. And in here, we have a rebuild project. So if I want to rebuild this project, there's a whole bunch of them in here, but I'm just going to rebuild this one, and it's going to take a very quick amount of time because there's literally 3 or 4 programs in here that need to be compiled. I can do that for rebuild the project for all of them. Generally, you don't need to restart the language server. That used to be the case back in the day, there were some challenges with it, but generally not. As I said, OpenEdge project.json, we have our options here and our standard file. So compiling stuff, obviously .p's compile. I have my simple test over here that I showed you the screenshot of. So it's got a bit more in it than previously had, but to compile it or to run a single test, we can just right click here in the gutter and it gives me the option. So I'm going to run a test. It's going to take a couple of seconds. It's going to come up with a couple of errors. Let me just get that away. It switches me to the tests view. I'll make that a little larger. And so you can kind of see the methods that run, how long it took, which ones failed. A message came out of one of two of those tests. So we can kind of see very easily on the right here what passed, what failed. We can see this. If we click on this message, it will bring up they call the error peak, and it'll show you more information about that error. To be honest, I don't find this super useful. Sorry, the peak. Generally, the assertions will tell me what's going on, but sometimes you'll get an error. They'll say invalid handle, something like that. That may fail, and then it becomes more useful. But for that, we'll dig into debugging. Yeah, as I said, in here we don't have the configuration for the ABL unit tests, but that will do that. If we want to run, so we could run that test as well from the testing toolbar. We can filter or not. If I don't filter, it's going to go search all of my tests. But we can then see all of the tests and run them from here, right? With tests, we can run them with coverage, I believe, as well, etc. So one or more. As I say, usually in development, I'm working on one piece of functionality at a time. I'll do one test at a time. But having the ability to run a subset or a group of them is really, really useful as well. Coverage is also very simple, and we would expect our coverage. I was busy running and busy getting rescanning there. I'll stop that. No, why are you not? So sporadically it does this. I want to debug. You rerun it and just get the little the decorations disappear. Running that. Okay, that's busy doing its thing. Running that with coverage will show the coverage when it reappears. All right, this is why I love demos. We'll get back to the coverage. Let that think on what it's done in a sec. Okay. So unit tests first. The second thing is we're going to run some code, right? So unit tests are great, but we want to test our stuff. So how do we run code in this environment? The simplest version is F2. There's a couple of run things. The simplest version is just F2. Runs the selected .p in batch mode, and it just dumps output into the ABL panel. I'll show you that. So I mentioned the ABL and the ABL language server panels. When you run in the ABL panel, when you run batch code, that's kind of standard out, if you will, for those batch modes. I'm going to run the .p. It's not going to run a class because it doesn't go and add a .p behind the scenes. There's a run with pro-win option as well. It doesn't come with a standard shortcut. It's just much easier if you just add something like a shift F2. Or if you run it all the time if you only run pro-win rather than underscore progress, then change the shortcut from the key mapping to F2 for that. It just saves yourself doing shift control P, type the run, just do the shortcut and have a nice day. This works, I find, not surprisingly well. Obviously it works well, but I use it really quite heavily for just testing stuff. Simply, prior to the prior to the ABL unit test extension, I would have a .p that I would run, and it would just go and do, run our unit testing implementation. The ABL extension at first, when it was released, talked about using ABL testing, but I believe that was never fully implemented, if at all implemented in the extension. And I would expect now that with the features in the ABL unit test extension, that it would not go into the standard ABL one. I mean, I speak under correction, but the ABL unit testing extension is really, really good. Okay, so we can run stuff really easily with F2 or ABL run with Pro and ABL run with Progress. We can do that. But a couple of things. One, that uses the settings that are in the project. So whatever the extra parameters are, the assemblies, the CP internal, whatever that might be, it will use that. The Pro path that's in your project. You may want to change that. So tasks is the mechanism that Visual Studio Code gives us to do more stuff. And we can do a lot in there, right? The example here is, excuse me, is to delete all our code. So they have kind of two types. One is shell, and one is process. So if you have a process type of task, it will launch a new process. If you have a shell, it will try and run it in the shell. You can see here there's Windows and Linux options. There's the default, and then you can override that by operating system, right? Windows, Linux, and Mac OS X. OS X, I think, is the third one. Yeah. Again, these can get saved at the user, the workspace, or the project level. If you're going to do this regularly, if you've got stuff that's useful across, if you want to be able to run a particular piece of code always, a particular screen or window always, you should put that into the workspace settings. There's a problem matcher at the bottom here. So what this lets you do as well is, if there's output, if you're really masochistic and you want to get into regexing, but this will let you populate problems view, the problems panel after the execution of this task. I mention it here not to try and get you into regex, but that if you don't have one in the tasks configuration, VS Code will be like, hey, what do you want to do? Do you want to let them all go? Do you want to do something? And so it just makes life a little simpler when you just add them in, add the empty array in. So you can add a whole bunch of detail into that. Okay, so let's go back and look at some tasks. And we'll come back here and hopefully, okay, so my tests are back, right? So they refreshed themselves. Again, there were a lot there. I'll just go to running the test with coverage, and now we run the test with coverage, and now we can see test coverage view is included, and we can say that this test is what, 76% because of the code it executed. And we can also see, and hopefully the green is not too similar to some of the other greens, but you can kind of see on lines 40, 41, if we highlight over that, we can see which lines of code actually ran. So obviously this is a very simple service, but if we go look in our friend simple service over here, we can see on the right here the coverage that comes out, right? So we ran those lines of code. We have not run those lines of code. That's not good, right? So this gives us a good indication of how good are tests actually, because it's very easy to put simple dumb tests like this in here, but we should actually test this stuff. What's interesting to me is that that test over there should have got this coverage. I'm not sure why it didn't. But yes, just extra bit of information. So testing done. Running stuff now. Okay, so if I just do that. So in this world, the tasks are controlled through this tasks.json file. I have a whole bunch of stuff in here that I will show you. And it's edited in a largely headless way. we have an extension. There's an extension called the Task Explorer, and that goes and runs through all the different types of tasks it can find, including this tasks JSON file, right? So these are my user tasks that are in here, and other projects, batch files, and etc. Other things. This is useful, but you can run the task simply from, again, F1, run task, and it will list the tasks there. So for instance, I will run my business entity designer tasks, and that's going to run a program for me, right? So I've set it up, again, base key INI name, and a PF. That's got the .p to run. And on Windows, I'm going to run it, set DLC to that value, and run this command. Now, excuse me, you'll notice here there's a bit of funky syntax for where DLC is. And also, if you look a bit further down here, this dollar workspace folder. So these are environment variables or system variables, if you will, that Visual Studio Code provides, and documents a bunch of them. So you can tell the file you're running, you can tell the workspace folder that you're in. That took longer than I thought. And that's going to run. And we've run our code, right? So we can run our test environments however we want, and that's available through the tasks. The one that you're probably going to start using or use a lot, just to save yourself updating these things all the time, is this command syntax, command abl dot get DLC directory. And that is the ABL extension has exposed certain commands through there. So we can see some of them if we do IF1 again, and we just do ABL for filtering over here. There's, whatever, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever they are. Some cube one's a little mixed up in there. The one thing I struggle with a bit, which is taking me a long time to get used to, is this command bar, especially when you search for files. So I'm going to Control P. And I want to look for something like, I don't know, smart business entity, or customer business entity. In the PDSOE world, I could do capital C, capital B, capital E, and it would bring them. It would just bring the right one up. This search here seems to be some form of regex, so you can see it's brought up a whole bunch of weird and wonderful things that I don't actually want. It's not a gotcha. It's just it's different, and you have to get used to it. Yeah, so running stuff. So anyhow, back to my train of thought. Sorry. Get DLC directory, the commands over here. We'll see one of them a little later, but you can get these values from the extension. And if we look in, let's see, users, Peter, and that's going to be in, I'll just do it from the top here, .vs Code, extensions, and that's in Riverside software. In this package JSON over here, there's a whole bunch of the commands over here. So they come into, where were they? They were not there. Commands. There's a command section, and that's the commands that are available. I'll bring that up because we'll talk about that in a command in a bit. Right, so getting the DLC directory, that just says for this project that we're in, wherever we're running, get me the current DLC. Okay, so that's launching. My snippet showed delete all R code, which is kind of like that. So delete the code. And we can do fun things like use these commands, right? So command ABL project rebuild by calling the commands, right? So that's not just a DLC thing. We'll show you what happens there. And we can have dependencies. So in PDSOE, the concept of clean existed, which deleted the R code and then rebuilt things. Okay. So we don't have that, hopefully, yet in the ABL extension, but we can kind of emulate it using tasks. So if I now run a task and I run my clean project, it's going to do some cool things. Firstly, it's going to tell you which project do I want to build. And so I'm going to say, for now, I'm going to say the ABL one. As you can see at the bottom, it's now deleting all of the R code. And now it's calling that rebuild project, and I'm going to pick the project I want to rebuild. I'm going to cheat here. Well, I'm not going to cheat. I'll just run it in the background and go and build that project. So you can, if you look at the bottom right here, you can see it's building that all. So that's kind of nifty. So nifty from 2 points. One is that we can plug into the extension with these tasks. And the other thing is that we can do fun things like get inputs. So if we look at the bottom here, we've got some inputs, and I've got, I can pick a folder. And I've just chosen those two. I could have put whatever options were in there, and I can reference them in my commands. Unfortunately, this doesn't resolve any references, so it's kind of, you can't say get me the current workspace, a child of it. You've got to hard code stuff. But yeah, so that's a nice way of pulling tasks together. And again, it just makes it easier for me to then have to go into the terminal, type the command, go back there, do the thing. So that's, I think, pretty nifty from that point of view. Yeah, that was that, and all of those. As I said, we can see them in the Tasks Explorer. You can favorite them. I could run them from here. It's just a different visualization, right? This is another extension. This is not default functionality. Cool. Okay. So, tasks. And as I said, you're typically going to build those once. You're going to add them to your workspace settings, and you're going to be done. Right, debugging, fixing somebody else's code. So, as you would expect out of an IDE, a code editor, there's debug functionality in VS Code. So the ABL extension plugs in really nicely into that. It's got your standard kind of stuff, right? It's got, there's a debug view. That's this guy over here. In the activity bar, you can launch various things. We'll get into those in a sec. But it shows you parameters, buffers, temp tables, right? These are obviously ABL specific things. So for instance, in this example here, this is an object reference. That's one of the properties and the value of the property. And it's resolved an enumeration, an enum class into the string value, which is handy. Also see system handles, right? So file information, this object is down there somewhere, etc. And we can add watches on particular variables while we're running something. Breakpoints, stepping through stuff, right? Step over, step into, step through. It's another set of key mappings you have to learn. It's one, the step into is the F11 by default, which is not something I'm used to pressing because I'm usually used to that expanding everything, but that is that is part of the extension. As with all ABL debuggers, really, it's got challenges with trying to step into code or showing you code that you're stepping into that's in ProPath or not in ProPath. The ABL extension in particular has a challenge with if you have one project and you're trying to step into another project's code, even though the R code is there, the source code is there, stepping into it is a little funky. Which in our development environment can be challenging because we have a project for our unit test and we have a project for our source code. Other projects may not work that way, and then you can kind of step into stuff quite nicely. We'll walk through that in a sec. Debugging an application is takes some setting up, let's put it that way. So basically what we'll end up doing is we create a launch configuration, which is different from a task, but a launch configuration that can attach to another process. And then we start running a program that is debug ready that we can attach to. Okay, so there's a two-step. There are other ways, no, not other ways of doing it, but this is basically the way to do debugging. Right, so we have the attach, and this is very simple. There's a snippet. I'll show you how to set that up. There's a snippet for that. Basically, the important part here is request attach, and the port must be set to a particular value. 3099 is the default. You can set it to whatever you want to. On the task side, excuse me. On the task side, there's a couple of things. One is it must be of type shell to be attachable. And what we can do is we can say, again, use underscore progress. I want to use underscore progress in this particular example. We could have pro-win. And the args need to include this debug ready. So in my example, I'm running it on batch mode because I want the messages to go out into the ABL view. The other important thing over here is we can say $file, right? So that is whatever file we're on right now, go and run that one for debugging. The other important thing is that the program that you're running needs to be able to run for either long enough for the debugger can attach, or it needs to be an interactive program, so it's waiting for you for UI. Or you need to do some funky tricks to get this to work. I'll show you an example of that in a sec. Again, especially if you're running a batch program, it's not interactive, right? So how do you attach to that? Debugging unit tests, on the other hand, is dead simple. You right-click, you run debug tests, and it does all the hookup of all of that stuff in the background for you. Usually, this is my primary use case for debugging, is debugging unit tests. So I really appreciate that this is this simple in this world. Again, and you get the same thing, step through stuff, the whole palaver. Really quite simple. Yeah. So let's take a look at debugging. Okay. So as I said, we need a task. We need a task, and we need a launch config, what do you call it? So we have pretty much what I had in the slides there. -p file debug ready 399 da, 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 right? So whatever file we're on. In our launch, so our launches over here appear here. And so I'm going to go and add a configuration into my launch. I can do it from here. And it will give me some options to pick some templates. So those are snippets, but the ABL provides 3 or 4 of them over here. So I'm going to say attach to an AVM, and it will write all of that stuff that was in there into here. The host name I need to change. So 127 to my default, and voila, that's there now. So we can get to that point in one of 2 ways. Either from this drop down, you'll see it should be here now, attached to process. And at the bottom here, this is now, I'm just going to minimize this so we can see, where did you go? Not launched, pick a program, I run it, and over there, we can see, usually in this view, at the bottom it appears, but not today. So, debugging stuff, this is my, again, run it. The one thing I said here, we're going to run this in an interactive mode. Sorry, not in an interactive mode. We're going to run this in a batch mode, right? I had my task set up to run it in batch mode, debug ready. So if we now run this, it's going to, well, this is a very small program. Obviously, it's going to run through. In order to attach to it, and I just put it in include over here, and that should open. No, it's not opening. Why is it not opening? There it opens. Something along these lines. So I pass in some amount of time to wait, 20 seconds, 10 seconds, 5 seconds, whatever you want to do, whatever you feel comfortable with. And it's just counting down while the debugger attaches. So this kind of over here says if the debugger visible attribute is true, then debugger has attached. So what we'll see, output, I'll go to the ABL view. We'll get switched to this anyway. I'll just clean that up a bit. Is if we now run our program with our task and run task, and we are going to say run program for debugging, it'll be a countdown over here. I've done it long because I'm going to be talking while this is happening. I can now come in and I can say attach to code, attach to process, and I'm going to run that. And there we go. So now we are connected to the process that's running. So our .p is running in a separate underscore progress session, and we are debugging. So now we can, as I said, look at the variables. There are no parameters in here. There are no temp tables in here. And now we can kind of, as I say, step into, it's going to step out, debug is visible, out we go, back into our program, message hello. And now I can step into this program over here, right? So stepping into this, I'll just stepping into it, will take us into a placeholder because it can't find that, but as you can see, the message over here saying, hang on, we've got some weirdness going on here. I'm going to step out. But the nice thing here is we can see, we can see the system handles whatever this, it's not this object, but it's going to be target procedure, it's got some stuff in it, etc. So now we can keep on going and going and going and doing what we need to do. And we'll let that run. The other use case, as I said, my largely main one for debugging is debugging the testing over here. So let's debug this service over here. We're going to add a breakpoint over there, red dot, and now we can debug through this and see what we've got here. So I want to debug my test. That's going to do more or less the same. You can see the bar at the bottom has gone red. We've got the same toolbar, if you will. I don't know what we call this little guy. But now I can go and step into stuff. And now because my service is in my project, I see a lot more. Not much to see there. If I now step into this class over here, I can now take a look and see at the input parameters. I can see any buffers that are in here as well. And this is really nice as well. So we can see kind of what the values are in there. Usual, excuse me, debugging information we want to see. I'll step over you. I don't want to step into. And again, we can go and do the needful, right? Step over. The one thing to point out over here is, so we saw properties on the on an object earlier. We're not seeing them here, even though we've passed in something that is of type fetch data request. And that's because this parameter is defined as progress lang object, and it only has those two properties that we can go and view. We can step out of that. Actually, I'll run it again because I want to debug into that. But at this point over here, actually, this will make sense, right? We've got fetch data request defined as I fetch data request, and now we can see all of the properties that are available on that object. So that's just an important thing to remember, is that just the definition of the variable will define what you can and cannot see in the debugger. Okay. And we'll let that run to finish. So as I said, this is my primary use case. I think it's really nicely integrated, but it's possible as well to debug using say standard or debug other things. As you could see from the optional launch configurations, I can add one from the bottom right here as well. In the ABL world, it's possible to attach to PASOE. We tend not to do that, not for any particular reason, but generally it's somewhat faster doing the development, debugging in Visual Studio Code in the development environment, and we have kind of the tests that pick up on most of the things that might fail. Right. So, debugging. The last thing I'm going to do, and again, this is a different kind of integration, is extract annotations from my ABL code. So in the Smart Component Library, we use annotations to define a REST API for business services. And the kind of process for that is actually four-part broadly, but from a development point of view, we add annotations to a class, like you can see below here, something that looks similar to this. Where's this? But you can see this kind of defines what the URL is and what's exposed and what the operations are. Compile the class, and then we run an AND task to read that source code, PCT task, and generate another file, a metadata file, .annotations. And again, largely we do this because in the AVM, we don't have access to those annotations in our code. And that allows us to generate, for instance, a Swagger page off that. So how do we do that from a Visual Studio Code perspective? I'm not going to go into the details of what the AND task looks like. I'll take it from me that it's an AND task, standard one that you can run from any AND client, really. But what we use is an extension that's really handy for this kind of stuff called the AND target runner. And this not only lets you run targets from AND like it says, but the secret sauce here is that it automates it. So you could plug this stuff in as well into Progress Developer Studio, but now we can use that in a VS Code environment as well. Again, there's standard configuration, and the important things are where AND is and what parameters there are. So certainly for anything with PCT, you've got to add -lib and point it to the location of the PCT jar file. You may point it to other jar files like ant-contrib or something like that. So that's the one important thing. And the other two files that are important for the auto run is this file named build.auto. By default, you can name it whatever you want. That defines what are the auto targets. So you can kind of read from here, which is the build file it's going to, annotations XML, what are the targets it's running, that guy, and what pattern do I need to pass in there, right? So it's curly brace consulting work with something on the end that in the real one actually says comma demo, comma test as well, but I wanted to fit it on a line in the slide. Again, AND notation-ish that says, look for something named that matches this pattern and run it, pass it into that task. Similarly, interfaces, they look slightly different. Well, they have a slightly different pattern. Obviously, your coding standards or your naming standards may not call a thing a business entity. You may just do B, capital E, or BT, business task, whatever that might be. And when we pass that in to the task. The other file that's useful and important is a build.env. Also, you can rename it to your liking, and that's got environment variables that you can pass in. So you may your AND tasks may read from the environment, properties from env dot whatever. That's one way of setting them in there as well. You mix and match how you want to use that. Cool. Yeah, so going on to that. So I will just clean up a bit. I want to clean up a bit. I'll just go to a business entity we have here. And yeah, so that's got, sorry, I'm just cleaning up a bit. That's got some annotations in here, right? I'm just going to put another one on. It doesn't really matter what it is. I'll go get to that in a sec. That's the AND target runner. Just in the control comma is a shortcut to get here. Is to get to the settings, and we go to extensions, and configuration runners are is the configuration for this target runner. So the auto file name may be something else. I've changed it. Let's go to the work. No, I don't want to do that. What I want to do is workspace there, and configuration. Right. So we look in those two files, annotations, build XML. File name is build.env, and executable path we want to add the PCT jars, right? We use the ones that come with progress. We could point them wherever. Again, executable could be different on Windows. And that provides its own view as well, and target runner from that XML file. So we don't really use it that, as I said, in the build.auto, we have what I just showed you, right? And so what will happen now, if you keep an eye on the terminal down below, if we make a change, we go and add another REST method, entered it, and we're going to put that one delete, whatever, and I save now. That is kicked in. It's now running through it, but it's saying, okay, I've processed that guy over there. That's the one that's changed, and we've updated that. So that'll just run every time I change this now. I want to get rid of that because I don't actually need it, and it's just made up. It'll go and kick it off and run it again. So we can go and add this level of automation. And I guess that's the that's the main thrust of the smarter part here, is adding these kind of automations in, right? Whether it's something like an ant target runner, whether it's something like the tasks, and of course the unit test is also really useful. But the automation really lets you not think about, oh, did I remember to compile this thing? Not only did I remember to compile it, but did I remember to generate the pieces I need to generate out of it? That's I find really useful. Like, and I don't want to have to remember to do this every single time. So yeah, the other nifty thing. So we have these annotations. The one useful thing we found in Visual Studio Code is, if you can see on the right here, you can group programs together. So these programs all live in the same folder, right? All these files are not programs, right? The CLS, the annotations, there's another one of the BED, GM, and there's a PNG. These are our business entity designer artifacts. But we can group them all together and just hide them, so that if you've got a lot of code if you've got a lot of code in your folders, you can kind of squish them down and make it a little more easy to look through. So for instance, again, country table model. These are just set up in the settings with, now I've got to remember what the name of the word. They use expandable and they use foldable interchangeably, somewhat interchangeably, collapsible, collapse. And I always have to look for them. No, it's not collapse. But we can group them together that way, and I think that's really quite useful. I'll do one attempt to look for it. It's not groups. And as you can see, there's many set. The one thing to note, and I'll show you that in fact in the ABL settings, that is interesting, I should say. So a lot of settings are contributed in here into the UI, right? But some things aren't. So for instance, you can see here there's a label for it, but it just says edit in settings.json. So in this case, they get edited manually. There's not a UI to go and do this stuff. Again, I have clearly way too many versions of Progress installed on here, but that's where you would edit the runtime. You can see this is in the workspace settings, that code workspace file. Typically, these are in the user settings. Cool. Oopsie. So I think with that, that's kind of what I wanted to just highlight. It might be somewhat cheekily. It might be a code editor, but you can turn it into a very, very powerful IDE quite easily. Again, there's not just the extensions that provide stuff, but even the base functionality, right? The tasks, the the launch configurations, and even just the base ABL edit. I say the base ABL extension lets you automate a lot, lets you do a lot, and lets you, I think, just become, write better code more productively. Just on that, just to highlight a couple of places where you will be able to hear and see us. The Pug UK is obviously passed as well. We need a time machine for that one too. But a couple of pugs in Europe in the spring and leading into the summer, Lithuania, Germany, the Baltics in Tallinn, and France. In the big kind of global ones, Pug Challenge is in Boston in Westwood this year again. Towards the end of September, it's before the Pug Challenge in Valencia, which is in the first week in November. Obviously, there may be more coming. Things seem to change rather quickly in this regard. And with that, I'd like to say thank you and open it up for any questions you might have, any comments.
Well, thank you, Peter. There have been a couple of questions. I think I handled them in the chat. If not, please let me know. I would like to summarize on some of the questions. There was one question whether the ABL supports classes. It's not really related to VS Code, but I guess the person asking this question has seen classes in ABL for the first time in your webinar there. And the answer is that I would say for almost 20 years, if not even longer, since version 10.1a, ABL supports classes. It's not a feature of a specific code editor. So you could write them in Progress Developer Studio, you could write them in VS Code, you can write them in Notepad or in VI or Emacs or whatever, because it's a language and a compiler feature and a runtime feature. And it's probably not used as much as procedures in the ABL because they are there for 45 years now, but it's growing. And the other question was about whether there's any support for managing app servers in the VS Code extension. It is not, and my understanding is it's currently not a primary design goal by Jill Carrot, who's responsible for the extension. We use it with app servers, and one of the ways we do is we have the app server using the code in the development environment through the ProPass of the app server. So instead of relying on Progress Developer Studio being able to copy our code to the app server, we just have the app server picking it up where the development environment builds it. My personal opinion is this deployment of our code from Developer Studio into app servers never really worked outside of demos with 10 files or whatever. So I never missed that feature. For routine tasks that developers will need frequently, like knowing what is my app server doing, is it running, which state are my agents or my sessions in, and to trim them. We have built a VS Code extension, actually the first VS Code extension from Consulting Werk, that does all these tasks. I've put the link to that extension in the chat. But if you Google for VS Code extension PathOE OE Manager, it will be your first hit. You can install it. You need to point it to the PathOE instance through the host name, the port number, the ABL application name, and then you get through the Control-Shift-P command palette, you get all those tools. Works nicely. We're still working on adding features to it. I expect early next week there'll be a new release, yeah, well, if somebody has ideas, requests, they can log feature requests or bug reports through a linked GitHub issue tracker. Well, Project wanted to see the program that's parsing the annotations, and I said, well, that would be a topic for another, well, way more than an hour-long webinar. It's based on ProParse, and it's a feature that we built for our development framework specifically, but we could give insight into that. Well, I actually did a presentation at conference on that topic couple of years ago, so we could probably warm that up.
And in general, sorry, Mike, just before you go off that topic, in general terms, the testing frameworks as well use annotations to decide what's testable or not. So it, they tend to use the XREF XML, which involves a whole bunch of reading of the XML and trusting that that's correct, which it sometimes, the XREF XML sometimes is hard to read, especially for procedures. So the ProParse approach is more robust, more accurate, because it works off a proper grammar tree rather than a generated artifact out of that. But those kinds of things, that's where you would start if you wanted to look in that direction, would be one of those two routes. One is to look at the grammar, one is to look at the XREF XML output.
So then we had a question whether the VS Code extension supports development on the Seal average, so the .NET integration into the AWL runtime. Yes, it does. There is not a class browser like the one that you may know from Prox Developer Studio, but you get code completion. What you need to do is you need to import your assemblies and the details about the classes into a catalog file. So Control-Shift-P, there's a command AWL create assemblies catalog or something like that. Depending on the number of assemblies you have, it may take a couple of seconds to run, maybe longer if you have a slow machine. Yeah, AWL generate assembly catalog, and then you should have IntelliSense code completion for the methods of your .NET objects. Then there was a question on our experience using Codium. Codium is the AI-based coding assistant that we use. I started using it around about a year ago, last year Easter to be precise, and I do not want to spend a single minute in my life anymore coding without it. It really helps. It took a couple of weeks to learn AWL and learn our coding style, and now, well, every now and then it has a bad day. AI is not deterministic. It doesn't always do the same thing when you expect it, but it has gotten better and better and better. Yeah, so I really like it. What I'm currently testing is Codium's port of VS Code. They say, and other AI coding assistants do similar things. They say that the VS Code language server protocol doesn't give them enough flexibility to do the support for developers that they'd like to do. And for that reason, they've created their own clone of VS Code. It's called Windsurf. There they provide more AI coding assistant. My first experience with that are also very promising. The downside to that is clones of VS Code don't have access to the official Microsoft Store for extensions. And as Peter pointed out in this webinar, the extensions are really what makes VS Code so powerful. Actually, what I did in preparation for our adoption of VS Code, I've gave the list of the extensions that we use to a colleague, and she was looking whether they're available in an open VSX store. VSX is, or VSIX is the file format for these extensions, and that's an open vsx.org store. And I don't know the exact proportions, but let's say a third of the plugins have been available in openvsx.org. For the other third, we've asked the vendors, especially those from the OpenEdge ecosystem, whether they would like to deploy them there. And for instance, Baltic Amadeus and the maintainer of the AWL unit plugin, I think so, have then started deploying their extensions also to this other store. And for another third, we found the VSIX files either on the GitHub pages, or for one, we actually pulled the source code of the extension and built it ourselves, so that now we have access to all the extensions within Windsurf, and yeah, really are actually a step just one step before really using that as our primary editor. I'm not really happy about this development that now there are different versions of VS Code. I really hope that Microsoft might enable the AI coding assistant vendors to do what they want, but right now that's kind of like a fragmentation of the ecosystem.
The other, just to answer a little, well, the CLR bridge question, if it's not clear, I don't think I said it out loud, is that there's no visual editing tools built into the extension, into the ABL extension. If you want to do visual editing, even with App Builder or OE Studio, or the Visual Designer a la PDSOE, you have to launch those tools separately. That editing's not there. So the focus, I believe, is on the ABL code side rather than visual editing. I have no idea whether there's any desire by anybody, whether it's Riverside or Progress or any other third party, to add an extension to allow that.
There's been another question whether we are using dev containers within VS Code. I don't. That's mainly because, well, I'm not the
your love of Docker.
Because of my love of Docker. Okay, Peter, you spoiled it. I wanted to say it a little bit more friendly. Peter, have you used dev containers? I know Jill used them, and knows that works. Have you done any work with dev containers?
I know that it works. I share your feelings about Docker a little bit. So yeah, I mean, I know that the people who do use them swear by them. They're great for kind of isolation of environments, but not yet.
And Peter, I wouldn't pay you a Mac to try out whether you can use a dev container with VS Code to work on a Macintosh.
Well, and I know I mean, certainly Jill's environment is like that. He runs VS Code on a Mac, and he has got Docker containers in which he runs his ABL code, because ABL does not run on Mac OS. I don't think there's enough marketing people in the world that would make would get that thought done. No.
So I hope I haven't.
There's a question in from Vim about how do you transform 4GL procedures or classes into REST services. That's so the short answer is, the quickest answer is, instead of using the pardon?
The quickest answer is we don't.
Well, I mean, and Vim mentions the service editor, the REST URI service editor, and that's roughly, the annotations I showed you are roughly equivalent to that. Just they're programmable, and they're stored inside of each individual class file. We don't really do that for procedures, but for class files, each individual class has got its own annotations that describes what the URI should look like. The REST service editor is nice and simple, or nice and, the visual stuff is nice. The difficulty with it is the metadata that it generates is hidden somewhere in a dot file, somewhere in a dot directory, that is very hard to figure out. And the artifact that generates the PAR files are also equally opaque. Sorry, this is my soapbox. My love for that tool. It just makes it can be good for smaller API surfaces with smaller numbers of developers, but as soon as you start trying to get bigger API surfaces, more endpoints, more classes, more program, then you want to go something like what we've got.
So the two features that are really exclusive to Prox Developer Studio are the GUI for .NET Visual Designer and this REST Services Editor. Our day-to-day alternative to the REST Services Editor is, like Wim suggested in the chat message too, the use of web handlers. As Peter has shown, the annotations are our way of having a single REST, a single web handler that can be used for every piece of code. We're focusing there on classes, but those classes could then be launching procedures. It's the year 2025. I would find it a bit odd to invest time in restifying .p files. Honestly, I'm fine with using .p files as legacy and calling them, but for everything new, like new REST interfaces, I think it should be class-based. But that's my personal opinion. And the alternative for the GUI for .NET Visual Designer for us is our own GUI developer tooling in our developer framework, which actually writes the UI design into an OpenEdge database as attributes of components rather than generating source code. That's our, well, call it our workaround to the missing features in Progress Developer Studio. Good. Well, with that, I mean, we've done 90 minutes now. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, everybody, for...
Have a nice day. And yeah, we'll be releasing the recording probably tomorrow on Monday. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone. See you soon.